The Apollo 1 fire was a horrific tragedy, but the worst part was that it could have been avoided. Here's a deep dive into the decisions and circumstances that foreshadowed the deaths of 3 astronauts. During a series of tests at the Kennedy Space Center on January 27, 1967, fire broke out in the command module of Apollo 1. All 3 astronauts inside, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, died in the flames. While disasters like the Challenger and Columbia shuttles took place during their respective missions, Apollo 1 differs in that her crew never actually made it to their launch. Instead, the accident took place in the middle of a testing day, and even before the catastrophic fire, it was already something of a mess. The day played host to a ton of different technical issues. Most notable were the communication issues. The astronauts inside Apollo 1's command module should have been able to talk with their co-workers in the nearby buildings, but for whatever reason, those systems weren't working. The whole thing really got on Gus Grissom's nerves in particular, and he yelled out,
"Now we gotta get the moon. We can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings."
The command module itself was giving the astronauts a number of problems. Pumping it full of oxygen kept triggering alarms for no apparent reason, on top of making it incredibly difficult to even open the hatch. But seeing as how the boosters didn't have any fuel in them, the crew figured that things were safe enough for them to continue forward. One of the primary factors in the Apollo 1 fire was the environment inside the command module. The space was pressurized with pure oxygen at 16.7 psi. Oxygen is of course highly flammable, so any spark would have been enough to create a huge flame. But there's a whole history here that actually makes this a lot more complicated. During the testing of the early Mercury capsules back in 1959, engineers intended the capsule's environment to be a mix of nitrogen and oxygen. But logistically, it would have been too heavy and the mix ratio too complicated. So they settled on pure oxygen at 5 psi. But for ground tests, the low oxygen content caused an astronaut to pass out, so they upped the pressure. The higher pressure was effectively grandfathered into the Apollo tests, but the main difference was that the Apollo modules were a lot larger than the Mercury capsules. More space meant more oxygen, and that in turn meant more possibility of fire. Engineers recommended that mix of nitrogen and oxygen again, but NASA nixed the idea for fear that an accident might cause decompression sickness in that environment, so they kept with the pure oxygen atmosphere instead. Considering the rapid and intense nature of the fatal fire, the hatch to the Apollo 1 command module might seem like a pretty irrelevant thing to consider, but the hatch was no simple thing, and some poor design decisions might have condemned the astronauts to death. After all, if the 3 men had been able to quickly escape, then the tragedy would have been avoided. The hatch was in fact a death trap. It consisted of multiple different parts, including an inner and outer hatch, both of which served different purposes and had to be opened using different tools. The inner hatch also opened inward, which was a problem on its own. The pressure inside the module was higher than it was outside, a good thing in space since it helped keep the hatch closed, but a bad thing on land because it made the door even harder to open. Engineers recommended including explosive bolts that could knock the hatch off its hinges in an emergency, only for NASA to shoot that down. Missions after Apollo 4 corrected both of those mistakes by introducing an easily removable unified hatch, but the crew of Apollo 1 had to struggle with a hatch that was designed to lead to failure. The pure oxygen atmosphere in the Apollo 1 command module was already a disaster waiting to happen. But oxygen wasn't the only flammable issue. There's plenty of technology we wouldn't have without the space race, but at the time, American astronauts had discovered the usefulness of a very different technology: Velcro. It was a supremely practical solution to a uniquely space-based problem. Things that could start floating around in zero gravity were easily secured by just sticking them to Velcro positioned all around the interior of the spacecraft. They'd gotten pretty dependent on it, and it was tradition to customize Velcro positions prior to missions, to the point that fire prevention rules were getting forgotten. After all, Velcro is flammable, and it was getting stuck to places less than a foot from potential ignition sources. On its own, that was already courting danger, but Apollo 1 was even worse. Accounts of the command module describe it as wall-to-wall Velcro. No one realized until afterward that the increased oxygen content would cause these things to burn twice as fast as in earlier tests. All in all, Michael Collins, later calling the module a tinderbox, was quite accurate.
At 17 psi pure oxygen, Velcro explodes.
Many of the failures that led to the Apollo 1 tragedy were technical in nature. However, some of the factors were pure human error. On one hand, this wasn't a bunch of amateurs who were constantly making mistakes. Astronaut Michael Collins responded to the official NASA report on the disaster by explaining that even the smartest of people could miss the most obvious things, stating, "I don't know why, we're blind to them. I mean, it makes us think that the quality of our engineering across the board was juvenile, yet it wasn't. It was very good engineering.
There's so many things that can go wrong. The machinery is compact but complex, extremely complex.
But that blindness might also have been a bit more intentional. Earlier in the decade, President John F. Kennedy had promised that people would watch the moon landing, and that started putting pressure on NASA. As a result, the teams working on Apollo 1 were taking risks and ignoring problems. Flight Director Gene Kranz explained that there were plenty of botched simulations. Plans were far from finalized, and procedures kept changing over and over, but nobody did anything to address it. All anyone wanted was to keep their schedule, so they kept pretending there weren't issues. In taking the blame for the tragedy, Kranz summed things up by saying, "We were rolling the dice, hoping that things would come together by launch day, when in our hearts we knew it would take a miracle." In much the same way that the Challenger space shuttle explosion could have been avoided, the same could be said of Apollo 1. Had technicians just seen the dangers or kept safety protocols in mind, then maybe 3 men wouldn't have died on that day. But it goes far deeper than technical mistakes. NASA officials were explicitly told how much danger they were reporting, and they chose to ignore it. The contractors who recommended that the Apollo missions be tested using a mix of nitrogen and oxygen were completely shot down by NASA officials. Over the course of multiple different arguments, they were told just to do their job without question, despite internal notes fully recognizing the validity of those concerns, one of which even mentions, "It has been observed that a number of otherwise non-flammable materials, even human skin, will burst into flame in a pure oxygen atmosphere." Officially, NASA's response was more or less indifferent, expressing faith that a fire was unlikely. But once again, internal documents betray that confidence. The program's director, Joe Shea, privately noted, "The problem is sticky. We think we have enough margin to keep fire from starting. If one ever does, we do have problems." In retrospect, there are a lot of reasons to think that Apollo 1 was a doomed mission from the start, whether that has to do with rather obvious unsafe testing parameters or the other errors and mishaps that had already occurred earlier that day. But the most telling thing might be the fact that those directly involved in the mission could see the problems coming from a mile away. The 3 astronauts, and Gus Grissom in particular, seemed to have some pretty major reservations about the fate of their mission.
There is some risk. I recognize it, but just try to take as much of that out as we can during the pre-testing.
Grissom reportedly told a journalist that he'd consider the mission successful if he just got his men home alive. A worthy goal, but not exactly a high bar. Astronaut Wally Schirra even told him, "If you get the slightest glitch, get out of there. I don't like it." To really make their feelings known, the 3 men of Apollo 1 even went so far as to take a mocking photo, which has instead become tragically ironic, all of them with their heads bowed in prayer, just hoping they would come home safely. And they had good reason to be concerned. The craft was undergoing constant modifications to both its hardware and software. Said hardware was literally broken or leaking at times, and those problems were well known among the crew.
It had so many parts, it seems, that people lost count. Some technicians say it had 2 million. Some say 3.
Of course, there's no ignoring the fact that the Apollo 1 disaster led to the deaths of Grissom, White, and Chaffee, but it's also worth mentioning that the other technicians present at the scene lived through a harrowing experience of their own. Though the crew running the tests was spread throughout multiple rooms, the command module was directly connected to an area called a White Room. The technicians stationed in that room reacted immediately to the fire, trying to free their friends, only to be blasted by columns of fire themselves as pressure vessels ruptured and sent flames arcing toward them. Those who arrived in the room later found it filled with fire and smoke, ashes, and burning pieces of Teflon. The men continued trying to pry the hatch open, choking on fumes and blinded by smoke, all while knowing that a nearby escape rocket would explode if the fire got to it. Given the string of mechanical failures, lapses in judgment, and unintentional blindness that culminated in a near-literal powder keg on that tragic day in 1967, it's a small comfort to know that there was probably very little suffering when Grissom, White, and Chaffee were killed by that fire, because the fire wasn't what killed them, at least not directly. Of course, the fire did cause extensive burns to all 3 men, but autopsies determined that the majority of those injuries were suffered post-mortem. The fire actually burned through the oxygen hoses on the astronauts' suits, and they quickly fell unconscious due to the carbon monoxide flooding their suits. Officially, they passed away from asphyxiation and cardiac arrest. Several days later, sobered and resolute, Gene Kranz told his team, "We were too gung-ho about the schedule, and we locked out all of the problems we saw each day in our work. Every element of the program was in trouble, and so were we. I don't know what Thompson's committee will find as the cause, but I know what I find. We are the cause. We were not ready. We did not do our job." After the tragedy, NASA implemented major overhauls of the Apollo program to ensure it would never happen again. Engineers got their oxygen-nitrogen mix. The module hatch was redesigned from the ground up, live wires were shielded in metal. Those and other changes led to the successes of later Apollo missions, and arguably the success of the entire space program. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee never got to see the monumental achievements they paid so dearly to bring about.